Honor of having Dr. Peter Kreeft with us tonight to present to us in part of our Issues in Play series on intelligent design. Issues in Play is an opportunity that we provide for our members and their guests to learn more about the issues that are important to culture, the issues that are today affecting our lives, things that we see in the media, things that are affecting our families. Lumen tries to provide leadership formation in a number of areas, primarily business, but also in the area of culture as well, and that's the reason for bringing Dr. Kreeft in tonight. If anybody has a cell phone, this is the time to turn them off. We are actually videotaping the presentation tonight with an audio recording. And pagers, I don't know if they have those anymore, but oh, here are a few of them going down. That's great. Dr. Peter Kreeft is a philosopher at Boston College and has written, what are you up to now? 50?
About 50.
Well, about 50 books. Most people travel on the weekend. He writes a book on the weekend, you know. But,
somebody once said, this man has written more books than he has read. I think that was an insult.
Without any further ado, let's give a nice Manhattan welcome to Dr. Peter Kreeft.
Thank you for your New York hospitality, which to my mind has always exceeded even Southern hospitality. I'd like to talk about why we need philosophers in the intelligent design controversy. I am qualified to speak on this topic precisely because I am not qualified. I am not a scientist, nor do I teach the philosophy of science. I am not an expert on intelligent design or on the controversy about it. I am an amateur and a philosopher, a popularizer of philosophy, a bridge builder between normal people and experts. Experts. The word means arrogant, out-of-touch, self-absorbed, elitist technical crackpots. In every field, beginning with philosophy. I believe that the one thing holding together the 50 craziest and most destructive ideas in the world today, the one feature that stands out as common to all of them is this: you have to have a PhD to believe them. Well, intelligent design has been in the news lately for three reasons. They claim, first, that they have refuted Darwin. They claim, secondly, that science has now proved the existence of a divine designer. And finally, they claim that they have been unjustly discriminated against in high school biology textbooks by Darwinian fundamentalists who are as narrow-minded, intolerant, censorious, bigoted, and fanatical in their own atheistic way as the old biblical fundamentalists. The third claim is true, but the first two are false, and I will try to explain why. And the fact that the third claim is true does not justify the use of self-defeating tactics to defeat the scientific fundamentalists, because those tactics will unravel in the laboratory. My favorite philosopher is Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas always began by precisely defining the question, because if we do not get the question right, we will not know when we get the answer right. Argument is like a river. A polluted beginning pollutes the whole river downstream. So let me formulate the question as simply and clearly as possible. The question is, how did biological species come to be? The question is about biological evolution, not physical evolution or cosmic evolution or evolution as a universal principle. It's about this planet only, and it's not about the future or about ethics or about souls. It's about Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. It's about animals. What data do we have for settling the question, how did biological species come to be? Well, essentially two: the fossil record and our ways of dating fossils. Religious fundamentalists who believe that the earth is not millions of years old and that the days of creation in Genesis were literal 24-hour days argue that God could have created a world without dinosaurs but with dinosaur fossils. This is true. But such a God would be as deceptive as a God who created the world this morning and put fossil memories of yesterday in your minds. Religion has data too, but it's not data for science, for two reasons. First, because religion presupposes faith in divine revelation as the source of the data, and secondly, because the data is not empirically testable or quantitatively measurable. which are the two basic criteria for science. For Christians, religious data is essentially the Bible, and for Catholics, all the definitive teachings of the Church. And therefore, we need to say something about interpreting the Bible, since the fight about evolution, ever since Darwin, has been presented as a fight between the Bible and science. Mortimer Adler, in his very dull and very useful book, How to Read a Book, insists that we should always begin by classifying any book by its genre and its purpose. Genesis and Darwin's Origin of Species fit into very different genres. Even though they both claim to give us information about the same events, including the origin of biological species and man as a biological species, yet they ask different questions about this event. Genesis asks who, and Darwin asks how. Genesis does not ask how, and Darwin does not ask who. So to pair these two against each other in the same ring is like asking Muhammad Ali to play tennis against Andre Agassi. Now, there may still be some overlapping, and therefore there may still be some possible contradictions between these two, even though they're in different genres. As there are indeed contradictions between Plato's Republic and Machiavelli's The Prince, even though those two great books have very different genres and very different purposes. Plato is defining ideal justice, and Machiavelli is telling you how to successfully use power. Yet Machiavelli claims to have refuted Plato, which he has not, since Plato had already taken account of everything true that Machiavelli taught. Now, the claim of intelligent design to prove that there is a divine designer from the scientific data of cell biology is like the claim that historical observation and generalization, which was Machiavelli's method, could prove the existence of invisible, eternal, unchangeable Platonic justice, which is Plato's conclusion. It's a false claim, in response to the opposite false claim of the Darwinian fundamentalists to disprove divine design by the hypothesis of random mutation and natural selection. Now, my main point is that it takes a philosopher to sort out the confusion on both sides of the current controversy between the Darwinians, who claim that their science disproves divine design taught by religion, and the intelligent design people who claim that science proves it. But to prove my claim, namely the claim that it takes a philosopher to sort out the confusion on both sides between science and religion, we need to first define science and philosophy and religion. Defining things is boring, but it's absolutely necessary. It's like preparing the surface before you paint. It's most of the work. Science, in the modern sense, is the search for knowledge of the facts of nature, or the universe, and the understanding of these facts in terms of their causes. Its method is the scientific method. The scientific method, I believe, is the single greatest discovery in the entire history of science, because it is like a skeleton key that opens all the other doors. It also clearly distinguishes science from common sense, from philosophy, and from religion. The scientific method begins with universal methodic doubt, which means that ideas should be treated the opposite from people. People should be innocent until proved guilty. Ideas should be guilty until proved innocent. In other words, accept nothing as a fact until it is proved conclusively. The reason for this step of the scientific method is that in order to qualify as a scientific idea, the idea must in principle be verifiable and falsifiable. Unlike religion or philosophy, science settles questions once and for all to everyone's satisfaction. There are still pantheists and atheists and theists in religion, and there are still rationalists and empiricists in philosophy, but there are no more flat earth scientists or geocentric astronomers. How does science settle questions? How does it prove or disprove a hypothesis? By empirical data, often amplified by instruments which enlarge the power of our senses, and often by controlled experiments. But this also requires a second distinctive feature of the scientific method, namely quantification, exact measurement. Mathematics is the language of science because mathematics is the language of nature. In addition to these distinctively scientific principles of the scientific method, essentially three: universal methodic doubt, empirical testing, and exact mathematical measurement, Science also uses two methods of reasoning that are common to all human thinking: induction and deduction. That is, generalizing from observed specific data to a general principle, and applications of the general principle to specific cases, especially by predictions of what data would be observed if the principle were true. Philosophy is greater than science because it is the love of wisdom, not just knowledge, and about everything, not just nature. Philosophy asks questions not just about material things, but also about God and heaven and souls and minds and wills and imaginations and truth and goodness and beauty and knowing and loving and choosing and appreciating. Like science, philosophy uses human reason, not religious faith or divine revelation. Unlike science, philosophy does not require the use of the scientific method. It does not demand the kind of definitive verification or falsification that science does, the kind of certainty that will convince everybody in the world. Thus, in any century, you will find philosophers who believe opposite things. And philosophy also does not confine itself to empirical data or to the quantitatively measurable. Its data are often non-empirical intellectual data, such as the meaning of concepts and words. And they also include the data of ordinary everyday human experience, such as dying, or loving, or despairing, which is not scientific data. So what is religion? The word literally means relationship. In the West, as distinct from the Orient, religion means a relationship between man and God. That relationship begins with faith, which goes beyond reason, like faith in what mommy tells you about too many cookies being not good for you. The object of faith is God and his revelation in words, divinely revealed data, inspired holy books, the Torah, the Quran, the Bible. Now, it is possible, in principle, that science and religion might conflict about some things. It is also possible that we make mistakes about this, that we think they conflict when they in fact don't. If the bones of the dead Jesus were discovered in some Palestinian tomb, would Christianity be refuted? Rudolf Bultmann says no, he is wrong. It would. Certainly Catholic and biblical Christianity would, but modernist Christianity would not. Christian ethics without Christian theology would be firmly in place. If science discovered a letter from Moses that confessed that he had made up the whole story of the Exodus and the Ten Commandments, it was only from him and not from God, and if science proved that the letter was authentic, would that disprove religious Judaism? It certainly would. And if science discovered that Muhammad was really hypnotized by a human wizard when he was supposedly receiving the Quran from Allah through the mediation of the Archangel Gabriel, would that disprove Islam? Indeed it would. Well then, if the neo-Darwinians succeed in proving that natural selection happened and took place randomly, and that you didn't need any kind of intelligent design to explain it, would that disprove the Genesis account that God created the world deliberately and intelligently? No, it would not. But to prove that point, we need to go a little more deeply into the difference between science and philosophy. To see the difference between science and philosophy, let's focus on the two key terms of the intelligent design debate: the term life, that is biological life, and the term species, that is biological species. Let's see how science defines these two terms quite differently than philosophy does. Life is defined biologically, or rather identified biologically, by at least three properties. First, its chemistry is organic rather than inorganic. The principles of organic chemistry are not reducible to those of inorganic chemistry. Second, the parts of a biological organism are functionally interdependent. You can add any number of wings to a building, but not to a bird. And you could subtract a wing from a building without destroying it, but you can't do that to a bird. Third, its growth pattern is organic. It grows as a whole from within, determined by a genetic code. It doesn't grow piece by piece by accretion from without, like a crystal. Philosophy, without quarreling with this scientific definition of life has a more abstract definition of the term life. Life, according to Aristotle, the paragon of common sense, is the intrinsic principle of motion. That is, the source of change that comes from within rather than from without. That comes close to the third scientific definition of life. The thing is alive if it moves itself. Now, let's see how science and philosophy define the other term, species. A biological species is, scientifically, a kind of organism that can reproduce itself. Dogs are a species, cats are a species, and dogs and cats are two different species because they can't mate. Second, a species is genetically identifiable. Finally, the growth and activity of any member of a species is predictable and limited both in quantity and in quality, that is, in size and in power. Rats can't grow as tall as giraffes, and fish can't fly. Again, philosophy has no quarrel with this definition, but it has a more abstract and broader definition of a species. A species, at least in Aristotle's language, is a real kind. A nature that's possessed by more than one individual. Not just dogs and cats, but also fire and justice and triangles and angels are species, though they're not biological species. They're kinds, they're universals. Nominalist philosophers deny that universal species exist anywhere but in our language. They say we impose words on individual things by classifying this buzzing, booming confusion that is the objective world for our own subjective purposes. Nominalism says all dogs are really different, and it's only a linguistic convention that makes us call them all dogs. There's no such thing as dogginess. Species are fictions. Nominalism is a form of skepticism. All forms of skepticism are self-contradictory, self-refuting. Whether the form is expressed in a formula like I know that I know nothing, or I'm certain that I'm not certain, or it's absolutely true that there's no absolute truth, or the nominalist formula, all uses of the word all are false, including that one. Okay, our preparation is done. We're now ready to paint. The question is, how did species originate? So far, there have been only two clear theories about this, at least that I've ever heard of. One is evolution. The other is special creation. That is, the separate, miraculous creation out of nothing by each species, by God. There may be a third answer tomorrow, so the refutation of one of these two answers doesn't constitute a proof for the other one. Nearly all the scientists in the world believe that evolution really happened. If this is correct, then the next question is, how did it happen? As far as I can make out, there are three answers to that question, three theories that have been proposed. The first one is very old. It goes back to Anaxagoras, the Greek philosopher, earlier than 400 BC, and St. Augustine, around 400 AD, both of whom proposed that God planted seeds of life in matter and gave these seeds the power to grow into new species. It's a primitive form of the idea of evolution. But unlike the theory of evolution, it is not a scientifically testable idea. Second, Lamarck proposed the theory that evolution happened by the hereditary transmission of environmentally acquired characteristics. This is a scientifically testifiable idea and has, I believe, been definitively refuted. Third, Darwin proposed natural selection, the survival of the fittest organisms that were produced by statistically random genetic mutations in the struggle for existence. This is a scientific theory, and it is in principle testable, or can be made testable, or perhaps can be made testable. At least it has never been refuted, and therefore it is the only theory that scientists today accept. Well, the next question then, granted that evolution happened, and granted that it happened by natural selection, is how did natural selection happen? Specifically, does this require intelligent design, or can it happen simply by random chance? The so-called neo-Darwinians propose the latter, random chance. This is where intelligent design theorists demur. They argue that irreducibly complex biological structures, composed of many parts cooperating together to produce the same effect, like an eye, or even a single cell, cannot possibly, in principle, ever arise by mere chance or randomness, because the entire structure must be present before it can work to integrate its parts organically. Michael Behe, in Darwin's Black Box, gives the example of a mousetrap. It cannot work to trap any mouse until every single part is already in place. Now, this sounds like a good argument. It is a version of the famous watchmaker argument made famous by Paley. If we find a watch, it's quite reasonable for us to infer a watchmaker. And the only watchmaker adequate to explain the design in the watch is an intelligent watchmaker, not merely blind random chance. The parts of a watch do not evolve into a watch by chance, no matter how much time there is. The plane that I flew to New York City today did not happen by throwing its parts into a big box and shaking it. This talk that I'm reading didn't come about by an explosion in a print factory, not even explosion number 986 billion. That argument sounds very reasonable, and I think it is a good philosophical argument, but I think it's a bad strategy because it's bad science and bad logic. It argues that since we cannot possibly see, at least now, cannot at all see how an organism could ever arise without intelligent design, therefore there must be intelligent design. I think that's the fallacy of the argument from ignorance. It's the same sort of argument a great genius once used, Isaac Newton. Newton said that he could prove divine design in the solar system because all the planets orbit the sun in the same direction and on the same plane. And in Newton's day, no one could see how this could possibly happen unless the particles of the gas cloud from the sun that eventually condensed into planets was first of all deliberately correlated and ordered in a way that was chosen rather than random in order to produce this orderly result that we see in the solar system. So, like the intelligent design theorists, Newton thought that this was scientific proof of divine design. He had a second proof. He believed that the mutual gravitational attraction between the planets would cause their orbits to wobble more and more like a top, unless God intervened to keep them level. He was wrong on both counts. Laplace showed how the observed results were possible by chance. Any rotating cloud of particles with gravity will tend to form a flat rotating disk. Once he discovered this, Laplace said about Newton's God, "I have no need of that hypothesis." Another example is the formulation of crystals by random molecular motion. This is something scientists thought impossible at first, but then later they explained. Similarly, evolutionary biologists cannot now explain how random mutations can produce natural selection. The theory is not at all complete. It's got a big hole in it. But they may explain it tomorrow. My point is that God cannot be proved by showing gaps in science. The God of the gaps argument is always bad strategy because the gaps may be filled in tomorrow without God. And that will discredit the believer's God by discrediting their bad science, which they pinned to their God. It's also bad science because it assumes that there's not going to be any Laplace tomorrow. And it's bad philosophy, bad logic, because even if no Laplace emerges to fill in the gaps, it's still an example of the logical fallacy of the argument from ignorance. We do not know how this can be without something like a God, therefore there is something like a God. That's fallacious logic. There have been other, earlier versions of the God of the gaps argument against Darwin, which point to weaknesses in Darwin's theory, weaknesses that really exist, but which do not prove the existence of divine design. The Darwinians often stubbornly censor open-minded inquiries about these weaknesses, and they render Darwinianism suspect by their behavior. just as religious fundamentalists render religion suspect by their behavior. The weaknesses or gaps in the Darwinian theory are, as I understand them, essentially four. All take the form of empirical data, which are different from the data that the theory predicts. First, there doesn't seem to be nearly enough time for all the species to have evolved by natural selection. Second, it's been shown that random mutations don't favor the species that are stronger to survive, but the ones that are weaker. Third, the new species spring up much too suddenly. Finally, there are no fossils of transitional forms, no so-called missing links. Now, these are four serious gaps in Darwinism. The third is supposedly filled by the hypothesis of punctuated equilibrium, but no one quite understands what that means. These gaps, my point is, may be filled in the future. And even if they can't be filled in, the gap does not prove that there is a God. In fact, I would go so far as to say as there can be no scientific proofs for God. God does not leave fingerprints, or calling cards, or signatures. He leaves clues. God could have left permanent miracles. He could have created out of nothing a sign hovering in space saying, "I exist, signed God, P.S. haha, all you atheists." And he could have invited NASA to send up rockets to investigate that sign. And he could have recreated that sign at 6 o'clock every morning and destroyed it completely at 6 o'clock every evening. And if he had done that, probably everybody in the world would have believed there's some sort of a God. He didn't do that. Jesus could have hung around for another 2,000 years. He could have walked into scientific laboratories and said, "Shoot me, I'm better than Superman." He could have said, "Want me to do a miracle? I'll do it. Tell me what you want me to do." Zap, there it is. Everybody would believe. But really, nobody would believe. Everybody would believe with their head. Nobody would believe with their heart. Lovers don't propose in syllogisms. They don't bring lawyers to their mating rituals. It's not God's strategy. In fact, God has been very reluctant to perform miracles. The church is rightly suspicious of claims of miracles. Yes, they happen, but they're not normal. And when he does perform miracles, they are never proofs. People saw Jesus perform miracles. They still didn't believe in him. It's significant that the biblical word used for miracles in the New Testament is the Greek word semeia, which means signs, not proofs. A sign is like a pointing finger. It invites you, but it does not compel you to follow the pointing. The photons of light from that finger bombard your eye, and you have no free will to choose to see or not see the finger. But you do have the free will to follow the finger or not to follow the finger. God is very gracious, and he appeals to our free will wherever he can. So he gives us just enough light for seekers. Those who seek will find. It implies that those who don't seek will not find. He doesn't give you so much light that if you don't seek him, you'll find him against your will. Except, of course, in the next life, when it's too late. Now, I believe there are many very good arguments for the existence of God, but I think they're all philosophical arguments, not scientific ones. In fact, the philosophical argument for design, I think, is a very good one. It's essentially St. Thomas Aquinas' fourth way. However, design is not a scientific concept. It's a commonsensical concept, and it's a philosophical concept, but it is not a scientific concept for two reasons. One, it's not quantitatively measurable, and two, it's not empirically testable. It's very much like the concept of purpose, or teleology, or final cause, or end. This is true, and it's commonsensical, and it's good philosophy, but it is not good science. In fact, only when modern science distinguished itself from philosophy and stopped trying to find the final causes or purposes of things, only when physicists stopped arguing like Aristotle that the reason why fire rose and stones fell was because they were seeking their natural end or home. Only when science began to confine itself to measuring and observing did science progress to certainty and to definitively verifiable and falsifiable theories. So, science in principle cannot prove or disprove God. The observation and measurement of what happens in a fishbowl neither proves nor disproves the existence of the person who designed the fishbowl, because the fish owner isn't one of the fish. The creator is not a creature. God is not data. And even when he becomes a creature by the incarnation, he masks himself. All right, our question is, how did species come to be? There are at least three very different ways to answer questions. That is, to find truth, to gain knowledge, and to give reasons for believing any idea. They are religious revelation, philosophical argument, and proof by the scientific method. Revealed religion appeals to faith. A natural offshoot of revealed religion is religious theology, which presupposes this faith and then combines faith and reason by exploring and explaining and expanding that faith data by reason. Philosophy, unlike revealed theology, does not assume faith. One of the divisions of philosophy is philosophical theology. Philosophy speculates about the existence of God, but by means of philosophical reason alone, not by religious faith. And good philosophy comes up with some very good arguments for God. Finally, science uses its narrowed version of reason, the scientific method, like a laser beam. And the fourth method for finding truth is, of course, common sense, and that uses whatever. It's pragmatic, everything in sight. All right, now let's ask what revealed religion tells us about the origin of species, and let's ask what religion, both revealed and theological, tells us about the origin of species, and let's ask what philosophy tells us about the origin of species. First, revealed religion. It tells us that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, that is the universe. And it tells us that God is intelligent, and therefore he created by deliberate, intelligent design. It also tells us that he created by distinguishing different species. Notice that each of the days of creation is a day of distinction between being and non-being, light and darkness, sea and land, living and non-living, birds and fish, species and species. It also tells us that he created in an order, which is essentially the order of progression from the simple to the complex forms. Finally, it says that he did this over a period of time called days. And he did it by bringing forth or forming these things from the earth and forming man's body from the dust of the ground. The word for create, barach, a distinctive Hebrew word existing in no other ancient language, which means create out of nothing, an idea that no one in the history of the world has ever gotten into his head unless he's a Jew or learned it from the Jews. There is no word like that in any other language. That word is used only 3 times in Genesis, not used for each of the days of so-called creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it says God created the animals, the life forms, beasts, and it said God created man in his own image. All the other so-called acts of creation are described by the other word, I don't know offhand what it is in Hebrew, meaning formed or make. Now, none of these pieces of religious data that I've just mentioned conflict with the theory of evolution. And some of them positively suggest it. For instance, God forming life forms from the earth and proceeding from simple to complex organisms. Genesis also tells us that man has a double origin, that God formed his body from the earth and breathed his soul into him from himself. Well, that also does not conflict with the theory of evolution, because the theory of evolution doesn't say anything about souls. All right, next, what does religious theology tell us about the origin of species? I think it deduces the probability of evolution, that is, the evolution of higher forms of life from lower forms of life, more complex from less complex species, from the principle that God would probably do this because he loves nature, and he loves to use nature, and he loves to use second causes, and that grace perfects nature and uses it as an instrument rather than setting it aside or rivaling it or demeaning it. So it fits, it's fitting. All right, what does philosophy tell us about the origin of species? Well, not very much, but at least it heads us off from two confusions. It distinguishes this philosophical question from the question about God, and also from the question about the human soul, or spirit, or mind, that which thinks, and that which thinks about itself, that which is not just an object of thinking, but a subject of thinking, an I. Like God, souls are not material. Souls are not bodies. Like God, souls leave no fossils. So the theory of evolution says nothing about God and nothing about souls. It doesn't say whether they exist or not, and it doesn't say if they exist, how they came to be. So philosophy, good philosophy, would argue that while biological species can possibly evolve from each other, whether by strictly material forces without intelligent design or by a prior intelligent design, in any case, souls cannot possibly ever, in principle, evolve from matter alone. You can sooner squeeze blood out of a stone than you can squeeze intelligence out of molecules. You don't get one bit closer to the knowledge of X by getting more complex X's, whether those X's are dots on a page or molecules in a cell. For the knowledge of a thing, knowledge about a thing, cannot be one of that thing's parts. Knowing is an act that has two different sides, the knower and the known, the subject and the object. The subject side of the knowledge act is more than the object side. That's a basic principle of epistemology. So the knowledge of an object cannot be merely one of the parts of that object. Which is why souls can't be what Descartes thought, in the pineal gland somewhere. I think we need good philosophy to remind us of basic principles like that and to make the basic distinctions entailed by such principles. For instance, good philosophy tells us that computers can't think at all. At all. Any more than books can. They only store and logically relate information. They're just mobile books. They don't understand a thing. It's only sloppy thinking or anthropomorphic personification that makes us speak as if computers think. There is no such thing as artificial intelligence. It's an oxymoron. Good philosophy also tells us something about the consequences of biology for ethics, especially what those consequences are not. For instance, good philosophy tells us that even if evolutionary biology explains animal love and self-sacrifice genetically, that does not explain and does not threaten human love and human self-sacrifice, because human choice does not exist among animals. Human choice among understood alternatives is not the same kind of thing as animal instinct, animal desire, or animal sensation. We share all these things with the animals, but we have something they simply don't have. We can understand universal abstractions like the good in itself. And therefore, we can choose between different concrete particular goods. Animals cannot do that. Thus, the future discoveries and explanations of evolutionary biology will not prove that people should now be treated as pets, or that pets should now be treated as people. It will simply show more detail about our pets and about our common biological heritage, about the biological nature that the human spirit builds on and uses and transforms and gives new meaning to, somewhat as divine grace builds on and uses nature. Good philosophy also tells us that if there is an all-knowing God, it logically follows that there is no such thing as chance or randomness or chaos anywhere in objective reality, only in human knowledge. Thus, Einstein rightly rejected Heisenberg's claim that subatomic particles, which we could not predict, really were ultimately in themselves objectively unpredictable and indeterminate, that is, uncaused, either in their position or in their velocity. Einstein says no, God does not play dice with the universe. His use of God made that a religious statement, but it's also a good philosophical statement. Nothing just happens. Everything that happens has a cause, a reason. And certainly, if there is a God, an all-knowing and all-powerful creator, certainly nothing can just happen in his creation any more than some of the words in Hamlet just happened without Shakespeare's knowing and designing them. An omnipotent God would know the fall of every hair and every dice. But randomness can still be a perfectly good scientific concept. But it refers to human knowledge of nature, not nature itself. It refers to how nature appears to us, not how nature appears to God. So randomness is a perspectival concept, an epistemological concept, a psychological concept. It's not metaphysical. I think we need good philosophers to sort things like this out, because these three other methods of answering questions, namely religious revelation, religious theology deduced from revelation, and science, are often confused, especially by atheists who think that science disproves God. So I think it's important for us not to buy into the same confusion and think that science proves God. God is not a scientific hypothesis. Laplace was wrong. He was a good scientist, but a bad philosopher. So I think this is the biggest mistake of the intelligent design people. It's bad philosophy masking as science. There are a lot of other examples of that. Marxism, for instance, a notorious example of a bad philosophy masking as science. It's not science because it cannot be disproved by any empirical observation or argument. As far as argument is concerned, Marxists will always classify any anti-Marxist argument as capitalist propaganda. As far as observation is concerned, the Marxist will always interpret everything he observes as class conflict and oppression, cleverly masked as love or friendship or cooperation. So Marxism is not science. It cannot be refuted. It is a religious faith, a faith in atheism. Just like the Christian's faith in the existence of a good God, even in the face of the most enormous evils that count against the existence of God, like suffering, death, a Holocaust, or a crucifixion. No quantifiable amount of evil can refute the Christian belief in a good God. I remember when I was about 18 years old, I think I was a freshman in college. I took a philosophy course. I thought I knew everything. Freshmen think they know everything. And my pious aunt, they say aunt in Massachusetts, had just come back from Chicago to New York on the train and said, "Oh, a wonderful thing happened to me. Now I know there was a God watching over my life. The train that I was supposed to take cracked up and 16 people were injured. And something told me to just relax and have a nice dinner in the train station in Chicago, so I took the next train and I'm safe." And I said to her, "Aunt Edna, if you had been on the train that cracked up and you had been one of the people that broke their legs, would that prove to you that there wasn't a God?" She said, "Oh, you're going to college and studying philosophy, aren't you?" Well, I probably said that just to be arrogant and clever and confuse her, but that's a perfectly legitimate question, and her answer should have been no, it wouldn't. Because God is not a scientific hypothesis that could be refuted in principle by a certain quantifiable amount of evil, such as 18 people rather than 16 getting hurt on the train. That's perfectly proper in religion. It's not at all proper in science. So Marxism is not a science, it's a religion. Fortunately, it has died everywhere except in America. Freudianism is also religion masking as science. It's utterly unscientific because it cannot in principle be refuted. Whatever empirical data seem to refute it will simply be classified by the Freudian in his categories. That is, fitted into the id, the ego, and the superego framework, or explained by the Oedipus complex. You say that only because your mother dropped you on your head when you were a baby. The genetic fallacy. Many Darwinians are Marx-like and Freud-like religious fundamentalists. So my only plea is let us not make the same mistake. Let us be good scientists, open-minded and modest. Let us not follow philosophical systems masquerading as science, even if they are theistic rather than atheistic. This is why I don't think much of intelligent design. Now comes the fun part. I am always amazed at how polite and patient audiences are in listening to speeches. I've never heard a speech, or almost never, that wasn't boring. And I've never heard a question and answer session that wasn't interesting. So your purgatory is over, now it's heaven. Questions, please.
Feel free.
There will be questions. There's a famous old story about, I've got to tell this story. Whenever you hesitate to ask questions, I shove my story in. Aristotle had just given a lecture in the Lyceum, the world's second university, and there were no questions afterwards. He was disappointed, so he said, "If you were listening, the subject of my lecture was levels of intelligence in the universe. According to my philosophy, there are three. There is divine intelligence, there is human intelligence, and there is animal intelligence. And according to my philosophy, we can distinguish human intelligence simultaneously from both divine intelligence and animal intelligence by the same fact. Humans ask questions. Gods ask no questions because they know too much. Animals ask no questions because they know too little. Now, you have no questions. Does this mean that you have succeeded in raising yourself to the status of gods, or that you have sunk to the level of beasts?" After that, there were questions. Any human beings here?
Well, how does a Christian
Go ahead.
how does a Christian engage in this debate then? I mean, because there's nothing you can say to prove it or disprove it, so you just sort of, I mean, just like you said, seekers get enough light to find it, and if you're not seeking, you don't find it. It sort of leaves you in this position of, we're not going to have your paper with us to discuss it at length, the pros, the cons. So and this discussion, this is really not anywhere.
That's very similar to the question, how does a Christian be a good carpenter? I think Jesus didn't get all sorts of distractions and pietisms in his mind and give excuses for making bad tables because he had good intentions. I think Jesus made the best tables in Galilee. So I think a Christian scientist should be the best scientist in the world. And a Christian dress designer should to design the most beautiful dresses in the world. If anything's worth doing, it's worth doing well. There's a special Christian motivation for doing it, for the glory of God. But the it that is being done is defined naturally, not supernaturally.
I didn't quite follow at the end there. Were you saying that design is not scientifically...
Yeah.
You're saying it's not verifiable
Yeah.
or refutable?
Yeah.
Okay, how can you...
It's a common sense concept, and it's a philosophical concept, but it's not a scientific concept. Because all sorts of incredibly complex things can happen without human design by random chance. So you never know how much complexity or how much order proves the existence of intelligence. There's no quantifiable amount, just as there's no quantifiable amount of suffering that proves or disproves God. So there's no quantifiable amount.
I don't understand that either. Could you explain?
Well, the famous argument for atheism, the only really good one, is if there's a good God, why is there evil? And the best answer to that, I think, is the answer of Job. If there is a God, we wouldn't know, would we? Woody Allen has a line in one of his movies. He's a Jewish father, sort of an absentee father, and his son has become an atheist, and his wife blames him. And she says to him, "It's because you never talk to our son. You never explain God to him." "What does he want to know?" says Woody. "Well, he wants to know if there's a God, why are there Nazis?" Woody says, "Why are there Nazis? I don't even know how the damn can opener works. How do I know why there are Nazis?" That's a very good answer. That's basically Job's answer.
Okay, so you're saying that the existence of evil cannot refute the existence of God.
Well, there's two different versions of the problem of evil. One is very weak and one is very strong. The weak one, which is emotionally stronger, is, oh, look at all the evil in the world. How could God have allowed the Holocaust?
Right.
Well, that's a weak argument, because where's the line? Suppose there had been only 600 Jews instead of 6 million Jews. Suppose there had been only 6. Suppose only 1. Suppose instead of dying, they just were tortured. Suppose they just had a head cold. How much evil? You can't draw a line. The strong argument is any evil at all would disprove God. Wouldn't it?
Right.
Well, no, it wouldn't. But you've got to give philosophical answers to that. So it's not how much design, as opposed to randomness, you see that proves or disproves God. The line between things happening without deliberate design and things happening by deliberate design cannot be clearly drawn. All sorts of things that we thought could not possibly happen by random chance do happen by random chance. Now, I add to that randomness is not real. It's mental. We cannot see how anything other than random chance is working here. God is. God writes straight with crooked lines. The lottery. They throw some balls around in a container, and one comes out, and you win $1 million rather than you. Nobody designed that. Nobody said, this ball's going to come out. Well, God knows what's going to come out. But we have no idea how to translate that religious belief into a scientifically verifiable observation. It looks to us just like randomness.
Can I ask you about one of the intelligent design people's arguments? First, I want to say, could you think of design as being good philosophy masquerading as bad science?
Yep.
Okay, so I mean, if you said if they were to say our arguments are philosophic rather
Yep.
than scientific, they would suddenly become pretty strong
I think so.
arguments for the
Yes.
existence of a design.
Yes.
Right?
But maybe you could even say they're soft science, but they're certainly not hard science. They're not quantifiable.
Right.
You can't draw the line.
Well, one of the things that one of their people says is a mathematician named, is it Dembski?
Mm.
And his, oh no, this isn't him, sorry. But anyway, the Anthropic Principle,
Yep.
there are at least like 40 constants in the universe that everybody agrees on, and then a whole lot more. And like the weight of gravity and stuff like that.
If any one of them had been just a little bit different, no human life could ever possibly happen.
Right.
Right.
And the chances that any one of those, the mathematical probability of getting just one of the 40, according to Dembski, who's a probability mathematician guy, is one, it could either be like 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000. Well, the probability of getting just one of these 40 constants is 1 over more particles than there are in the universe.
Yep.
And you've got to get 40 of them.
Yeah.
So at that point, the chance of our getting these 40 constants out of just chance becomes virtually unthinkable or impossible,
Right.
and that's why all these physicists are having a nervous breakdown and beginning to think maybe there's a God. So what would you say about that argument?
I say that's an overwhelmingly probable argument for the existence of God.
Right. So, and it's a philosophic.
A million monkeys at 1 million typewriters would take 1 million years to type out Hamlet. Some mathematician said no, it would take 1 million times 1 million times 1 million years.
Right.
And the universe is more complicated than Hamlet. But there's two things the atheist could say there. Until you prove that it's absolutely impossible, there's always a possibility. But then you say to the atheist, why do you embrace that possibility? Aren't you like Mark Twain, who was an atheist all his life, and on his deathbed was reading the Bible, and one of his atheist friends said, Mark, what are you looking for in that old superstitious book? And he said, loopholes, brother, loopholes. Looks a little suspicious.
Question for you, Doctor. You said that in your talk that a philosopher is in the best position to make this determination.
To sort out the confusions,
Sort out
yeah.
confusion. As you being a philosopher, then, what's your conclusion? Is there a God,
Oh, sure.
and why?
Want me to give you 24 arguments? Take 24 minutes.
Your best 3.
Okay. There's a God because if there isn't, then the wisest man who ever lived is the most insane fool who ever lived, Jesus Christ. There's a God because
I'm sorry. The wisest man that ever lived.
this is the argument from authority. Most people believe in God. Most good people believe in God. Most wise people believe in God. The saints believe in God. Supreme authority, Jesus. Even atheists say he's a good guy. He's not a fool. Nobody ever staked his life on God more than he did. So if there's no God, then the better you get and the wiser you get, the stupider you are about God. That's bad psychology. Second, there's a God because I've got got to select one of these 24 arguments. You gave me 3. All right, I'll take it. I'll take it. 3.
Any number you want, in any order you want, but I'm curious.
Okay.
What do you think are your best, most
There's a-
compelling and
The most
clear
compelling, the most psychologically compelling, the most effective, not the most rational, not the most philosophically accurate, the most compelling. If there's no God, then the human heart is torn in two at its root, because then the better you are, and the more loving you are, and the more sensitive you are, and the more you love beauty, the more you'll believe in God. But your mind should tell you, no, God does not exist. So your mind and your heart go in opposite directions. Third, you desire that there's a God. Even the atheist
The logic
does.
between your mind saying there isn't is because of what? Your heart says there is.
There is only one
Feeling is
strong
important.
argument in the history of thought that even claims to prove that there is no God, and that's the argument from evil. And that can be answered, although it counts. It's difficult to answer, but it is answerable. There are dozens of arguments for the existence of God. I'll give you one other, the argument from desire. Put the idea of God on one side of the scale. A being with all conceivable perfections and many more. Infinitely good, infinitely loving, infinitely just, infinitely compassionate, infinitely holy, infinitely perfect, infinitely beautiful. Just the idea, whether God exists or not, that's the idea. Put in the other side of the scale every other idea that has ever come to any human mind in the history of the world. The idea of evolution, the idea of geometry, the idea of Platonic forms, the idea of arithmetic, the idea of other planets, the idea of fiction, all these other ideas, all finite. One idea is infinite. Now weigh them. The one infinite idea infinitely outweighs all the other ideas. Now, we're finite, we're stupid, we're weak, we're selfish, we're ignorant, we're mortal. Nothing about us is infinite. Where'd that idea come from? Doesn't fit. It's an alien. It's not a knock him down, drag him out argument. Freud can explain the origin of the idea, I suppose, but it has convinced many atheists. Dostoevsky, for instance, who I think is the greatest Christian novelist ever. He often has characters say, atheist characters or agnostic characters say, yeah, I'm an atheist, but what I can't understand is how this filthy, weak ape with nerve endings all over his body has ever come up with such a holy, beautiful idea as God. I can't figure that one out. That's a pretty convincing argument. And C.S. Lewis's argument from desire. If you're honest with your heart, don't you desire that there is some infinitely beautiful thing? Where did that desire come from? Every innate desire corresponds to something real. Conditioned desires don't. The Land of Oz, Superman flying through the sky, world peace, they don't correspond to things that will happen or are happening or are real. But any innate desire for food or drink or sex or sleep or society or friendship or knowledge, all these things exist. And we naturally desire them. And there's a natural aversion to their opposites. We don't like ugliness, and we don't like evil, and we don't like ignorance, and we don't like loneliness. And all these innate desires correspond to real things. Now, if the deepest desire of all is a desire for something infinitely perfect, something that you'd never be bored with, and if you're honest with yourself, you find that desire at the depths of your heart, then how come that's the only desire that doesn't correspond to anything real? If there's no God, then the devil is in charge because he's baiting the hook. It's designed. Every single other desire corresponds to something real, but this one doesn't. So the devil's like a father who's teaching his little son life's most important lesson. Trust your father. What do you fear the most, son? Heights. Okay, son, go up on that 5-foot-high wall and jump into my arms. Oh, I don't want to do that, Daddy. You have to do it to trust your father. Okay, here I go. Oh, you caught me, Daddy. I promised I would. Can we go home now? No, another time. 10-foot-high wall. Oh, I'm terrified. I promise you I'll catch you. Okay, here I come. Oh, you caught me. Can we go home now? No, one more time, son. 20-foot-high wall. Oh, Daddy, I can't do that. Yes, you can. Why must I do it? Trust your father. Okay, here I come. Splat. Ah! Why didn't you catch me, Daddy? To teach you life's most important lesson, son. Never trust anybody, not even your old man. Terrible joke. But that's what life is like if there's no God. I find those psychological arguments more compelling and more useful with students than the more scientific and more abstract ones like the first cause argument. And I find among many students Pascal's wager works best of all. Nobody knows deep down whether there's a God or not. Your only way of winning God is to believe in him. What do you lose? Nothing. What can you win? Everything.
Well,
What a bet.
You can lose a few things here and now.
It's almost nothing.
Well.
Almost
That's
nothing.
not how the world feels, but.
Well, then Pascal answers, actually the wager is much more than that. That's just the beginning of the wager. If you read Pascal, he says, okay, then try it. Experiment. Live as if you believed. See if it's a better life. See if it makes you happy. Oh, gee, it does. The things I've given up are little. The things I've gained are much. Psychiatrists are some of the most atheistic people in the world. More atheists in that profession than almost any other. Almost all psychiatrists recommend religion for their patients. Makes them happy. Makes them good.
And what you think and what you believe can be two different things, though.
No, it can't. You cannot believe what you think isn't
you
false.
believe in God, but deep down you have questions of whether.
Oh, that's different.
exists.
That's different. That's different,
You're
sure.
saying Pascal's wager. That makes logical sense.
But you can't believe what you know to be false.
What's that?
It's psychologically impossible to believe what you know to be false.
Okay, so if you don't know it to be false,
Okay.
certainly, then you know that there's a possibility it could be true.
Right.
So how do you complete that line of thinking? You think there's a possibility. The question is, to what degree do you believe it to be true? And how do you get up that scale?
It doesn't always come to a matter of degree. Once you eliminate impossibilities and you're stuck with possibilities, the next question is, can you prove that some of them are actually true? Maybe you can. So just because it starts as a possibility doesn't mean it has to end there. You can be certain that there's a God. Now, religious faith is trust in God. It's a personal thing. It's not an intellectual thing merely. I think intellectual belief in God can be definitively and certainly proved by good philosophical argument. But personal trust is always going to be threatened and tempted. God, why did you do this to me? Maybe you're not there. God has given our mind a lot more support than our emotions. Because you need an anchor more than you need. Absolutely. Absolutely. And even borderline cases that may not be miracles, but just wonderful things. Of course.
Right, so, yeah.
Those who are open to it, open to these pointing fingers, are impressed. Look at all the fingers pointing in that direction. Wow. But those who are not open to it will not be convinced by it because it's not definitive scientific proof. If you want to, you can always explain away a miracle.
Switching topics, for those who haven't read the Ecumenical Jihad, can you explain why you wrote it, and has your feelings changed at all after 9/11?
No, they become stronger. My point I make in Ecumenical Jihad is that I think God is calling us to a new era of ecumenical cooperation without compromise. That the great religions of the world, especially the three great Abrahamic religions in the Western world, since they worship the same God, although in very significantly different ways, should be able to unite in following the baton of the single conductor and thus sing much more in harmony than they do. And that's not a radically new idea. It's basically Pope John Paul II in Ut Unum Sint and other things. And especially with respect to Islam, here is a religion that's very primitive, that has a lot of power, a lot of force. And like nuclear power, it can be used for evil very powerfully and it can be used for good very powerfully. Corruptio optimi pessima, the corruption of the best things is the worst thing. So when you see something very bad, like self-righteous, arrogant, fanatical, pharisaical Muslim terrorists who think they're going to heaven because they're going to kill people, that's the perversion of something that can be very good. There are a lot of Muslim saints, and by comparison with Muslims and religious Jews too, Christians are often wimpy and weak, and we can learn a lot of spine and backbone from them.
I still come back to like the original question after listening to all this. It's still, if you were, based on what we're talking about here, if someone were to ask me about God, you'd have to say, I can't really be sure of anything, but I believe it because it's better than anything else I could believe. That's just not very compelling or convincing. I mean, I think a Christian has to say with some assurance that this is what I'm staking my life on.
Absolutely.
And the reasons why. And is that just, you know, that you said seekers are get just enough light for a seeker. Well, for the person that's not getting the light, and you know, you can say those things to someone who's getting a glimpse of light. And maybe the most compelling thing I come back to is always the thing that moves people's hearts is love.
Yeah. Religious faith is not like a scientific hypothesis, it's like a marriage proposal. You can't be absolutely sure by even philosophical means, certainly by scientific means, that the person you marry is the right person for you and that they're going to make you happy and this is the best marriage. But you're going to throw your whole self into it. Absolute and total commitment. Here is my whole life, all or nothing. Well, God comes with a marriage proposal. And religious faith is saying yes to that marriage proposal to the human soul. And all of you is in it with total passion. Even if your intellectual proofs are only probable.
But you did say you felt that you could philosophically prove the existence
I can.
of God.
Many people feel they can't.
No, but you feel that you just can't give scientific reasons
Right.
for the existence of God.
I don't think anybody can give scientific reasons.
But you do feel you can give philosophical
I think many people
reasons.
can give philosophical reasons. I think many people can't. But the difference between me, who feel confident in philosophical arguments for the existence of God,
Well, the church
and other
feels-
pious
does the
Christians,
church teach that you can
yes, oh yes,
prove-
Vatican
it
I.
does, right, that you can prove the
Vatican I
existence of
definitively
God.
says, by faith you must believe that you can prove God without faith. But if you don't see that, that's okay. Pascal didn't see that. Pascal was probably very saintly. He was a little weird, so he wasn't canonized, but Pascal had very deep faith, even though he was
Well,
an
faith is
agnostic
different
about
from
proofs.
proof is from believing that it can be. I understand that, but you can. The church says you can demonstrate
Sure.
philosophically the existence of God.
Yep.
In addition, people need faith.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But suppose Romeo proposes marriage to Juliet, and Juliet doubts two things. One, whether Romeo is only an illusion generated by her dreams, he doesn't really exist, or two, whether he really loves me. Well, even if somebody convinces her that Romeo is not an illusion and really exists, that still doesn't prove that he really loves her, and that's what she has to know to marry him. She doesn't have to prove it. She believes it. She trusts him.
Maybe we can end it there and have Father Connor, our chaplain, say a few closing comments.
Well.